There's always a man, or well, something, standing right outside my window every night. I guess after that sentence, some would be telling me to call the police or tell my parents about such an invasion of privacy. But it's been occurring for so long, at the exact same time every night now, that it's become almost normal for me. It's constant taunting and almost challenging words always echoing inside my skull. In all honesty, I'm afraid that if I do something, it means it finally gets its way with me. That it'll do something I'm not sure I could even fathom. And at this point, I know me telling someone about its nightly visits is exactly what it wants from its little game, for me to be a tattletale. It all began 3 months ago. My family made the decision to make a huge move from New York to a way smaller town in the middle of practically nowhere. From what I remember, it all started when my small family of 3 sat around the dinner table, placed in the middle of our extremely cramped kitchen living room. The tight space was not something any of us were used to, as back in New York when my father was alive, we lived in a pretty large, pricey apartment. My brother and I each had our own private bedrooms, attached to our very own bathrooms as well. I suppose you could have called us the typical spoiled kids, born with a silver spoon in our mouths. It was only like this because of our father. He was a pretty great neurologist from what I remember, but because of that, he was hardly ever home, almost making him feel non-existent in our lives. The round table we sat at that night was covered by a Monopoly game board, the game of games, the destroyer of families. My mother was winning, causing my younger brother to violently push as many pieces as he could off the board and onto the floor in a quite common temper tantrum. Do you need to start getting grounded every time you choose to be a poor sport, Jason Gilbert Rivera? My mother said sternly, giving my short 9-year-old brother a glare that always automatically put him in his place, as well as my own. As fast as he had thrown the pieces of thin paper and plastic houses onto the floor, he was on his knees picking them up as if it meant life or death. The summer heat started to become imminent throughout the house, causing me to notice the light sweat that began to make its way down my skin. I quickly stood up, ducking my head low enough to let all my brown hair fall towards the floor, tying it all together upon the top of my head with a pink scrunchie I always had wrapped around my wrist. The small house wasn't equipped with any type of air conditioner, and on my mother's below minimum wage salary at a nearby diner, she could hardly afford to add any type of cooling devices besides a fan to the small house, even if she wanted to. I finally decided to open the window above the kitchen sink in an attempt to let in as much of the cool night air as possible. As soon as the old window actually succumbed to my violent movements in an attempt to push it open, it finally lifted upwards, letting a soothing, cool summer's breeze to caress my warm, clammy skin. As I reveled in the night's gentle, cool breaths gracing my skin, I stared out into the darkness before me. In my view was an abundance of trees, flowers, and lush wildlife scattered across to make the forest beyond our home seem more alive than it truly was at night. A weird shiver snaked its way down my spine as a slight but sudden movement in the corner of my eye caused me to tighten my grip on the counter below me. After a minute or so, I hadn't seen any more movement, so I began to give in to the idea that because it was so dark, I could simply write it off as my mind playing tricks on me. I always had scientific or perfectly sound explanations for all weird things I had ever seen or heard about. Any video my friends had shown me of a so-called poltergeist or ghost caught talking on tape, I always had to debunk them. Everyone always called me a loser for it because of the fact that I ruined the fun. They always had believing in anything even slightly supernatural or impossible. I chose to wash my face, as my eyes began to feel strained and hot again, as well as my head, which for some reason felt almost full or intense, as if I was underwater. After the cool water reached my face, I could have sworn that I heard a low, disembodied giggle come from the forest, causing me to instantly take a step away from the window, water dripping down my face slowly. "Hey Mom, did you hear that?" I asked, turning to face her still sitting at the table. She was now using the game board as a makeshift fan in an attempt to cool down better. After she finally registered my question, she simply looked at me in confusion. "Hear what? You mean the wind in the trees?" she questioned as she leaned her head back against the wooden chair, continuing to fan away the heat. "I guess," I stated with slight disbelief lacing my words. For once, I was contemplating if it was actually a logical explanation for something like a giggle to be just the breeze. I mentally slapped myself for even thinking that, and quickly stuck to the satisfying conclusion of it most likely just being the breeze rustling the trees, and my exhaustion getting the best of me. After the long move, unpacking all the boxes and furniture from the vans, I definitely did feel drained and ready to sleep the rest of the night away. Me and my brother now had to share a room, and that room just so happened to be facing the forest, just like the kitchen. The room is pretty small, so we got a bunk bed to share. Mostly so there would be more space for our combined possessions. Jason insisted on sleeping on the top bunk as it made him superior, but the biggest reason being the fact that he was always afraid that monsters were apparently underneath his bed, and me sleeping below him would save him the nightly under-the-bed check. The only window in the room sat right beside the bed, right around the bottom bunk. To me, it was the only drawback to our sleeping arrangement, as I didn't like to be next to windows or mirrors much when I slept. It was a weird little fear, but one nonetheless. As my brother finally finished getting all the pieces back into the game box, I told the two of them that I was heading to bed early, which was at about 10 p.m., 2 hours earlier than I normally would. After finally crawling across a few of my own unpacked boxes that sat in front of the bunk bed, I got under the covers, instantly realizing how hot it really was. I then prompted for the cooler option of leaving a leg out of the blanket, and for the top half of my body to stay uncovered as well. At some point, I finally fell asleep after quite a bit of tossing and turning in the torturous heat. When I woke up, I felt extremely unrested, and the room was still drenched in darkness. I glanced around confused as I never randomly woke up in the middle of the night for no reason before. My hand reached towards the ground where I left my phone to charge as I slept, slightly giving my fingertips a rug burn while I grazed the carpeted floor for the device. Once my fingers touched what I was searching for, I unplugged it and I turned it on. The bright light almost blinded me in the pitch black. Once my eyes adjusted, the time read 3:50 a.m., causing me to knit my brows in confusion. "What?" I whispered to myself quietly, knowing that my brother was most likely passed out above me by now. I tossed my phone, uncaring at the end of my bed, causing it to almost bounce back onto the prickly floor. I instantly rolled over towards the wall beside me, shutting my eyes tightly in a desperate attempt to pass back out, slightly annoyed at my body's internal clock most likely being messed up by the move. The next time I woke up, it was to the sound of a high-pitched scream, a scream that seemed to resemble that of a human's, yet something within it just made it sound so odd and unsettling. The sound was so alarming it caused me to practically jump out of my bunk and attempt to shake Jason awake fiercely. To my surprise, my hands fell flat onto the mattress, causing a loud creak to bounce against the walls of the box-like room surrounding me. I lifted his dark blue blanket in confirmation that he was in fact not in his bed. My adrenaline began to subside, as my mind somehow pushed the unusual scream into the back burner for a moment. I began to turn on my heels, taking a step of faith into the dark abyss encasing me, only for me to instantly go flying down onto my hands and knees over two boxes that I had forgotten were still sat beside the bed. I slowly got up, gingerly kneading the reddening rug burns gracing my palms. I continued to make my way towards the door, only to pick up the sound of what I presumed to be scrapes against the side of the house, right outside my room. The sound continued like nails on a chalkboard, causing an almost unbearable pressure to build inside my skull, making my toes curl. Once the sound had reached where I assumed was outside my window, it was replaced with what sounded like a hushed giggle, so quiet and muffled it could have been missed. In that moment, I didn't have the guts to turn towards either of the noises behind my back. The only thing I could force my horrified, frozen body to do was rush for the door mere inches away from me. Once my hand had reached for the doorknob, the sound of nails against a chalkboard continued against the house, making their way away from my window. In a panicked frenzy, I practically sprinted towards my mother's room, almost whacking into the door once I had reached my destination. Before I had the chance to knock at or even open the door before me, the now familiar scratching sound began to make its way towards the front door opposite of the kitchen living room. I should have just ran into my mother's room at that moment. I should have hid under the covers with her like I always did as a young child after a nightmare. But I didn't. I simply stood there, hand resting on the doorknob, eyes wide and staring towards the kitchen living room window as these scratches made their way past. Within the darkness of the still open window, I saw what I assumed to be part of a lengthy, slender shadow-like arm pass by slowly. It almost seemed to be following me. All logical explanations I would normally have began to fly away as my breathing became labored and hectic. Once these scratches reached the door, they ended abruptly, only to be replaced by the slow sound of a scratch and a knock. The knock was almost cheerful, if it was even possible, but at the same time it felt as if it was trying to be mocking. After a minute or so, it was completely silent. No lengthy scratching against the house, no cheery knocks against the door, just the sound of the slightly heavy summer breeze brushing against the trees outside. Once I'd calmed my breathing, I let go of the doorknob to my mother's room and slowly walked along the hallway wall that led towards the kitchen living room and of course the front door. I promised myself that I would only peek my head out from behind the hallway to get a better view of the doorway, and that's just what I did. I gripped the corner of the wall tightly, seemingly bracing myself for whoever or whatever I would see once I peeked my head out from behind my cozy hiding spot. Once I leaned slightly past the wall to view the plain, white front door ahead of me, another slow scratch and cheerful knock rang lightly throughout the house, as if whoever or whatever was there knew it had my attention, as if it knew I was finally close by. After a few seconds had passed, another slow scratch and cheerful knock landed upon the door, notably quieter this time. My head began to feel like the weight of 1,000 buses were pressing against it, an intense pressure building ever so slightly, as these scratches and cheerful knocks seemed to snake their way into the private dwelling of the mind. With that, I quickly came to my senses and ran for my mother's room, opening and closing the door loud enough to wake my mother with a jolt. A second body jumping upwards beside my mother at the loud, sudden noise echoing throughout the small room caused me to leap out of my own skin because of my already jumpy state. I quickly calmed down once I realized my brother was obviously sleeping next to my mother instead of in his own bed. "What are you doing up at 4 in the morning, dear?" said my mother groggily, obviously still half asleep. I had a nightmare. I said, prompting for the less insane answer to the seemingly simple question. Aren't you all? You can sleep with me and Jason for tonight, but I'm not sharing this bed with more than one person every single night, said my mother, quickly laying back down towards the edge of the bed, making room for me to squeeze beside my brother, who moved towards the middle. Once I was in the same room as the rest of my family, no more noises plagued me throughout the night, although I hardly slept after everything that had happened. Since that unsettling night, my brother continued to sleep with our mother. She seemed to never care as long as it was only one of us that slept with her a night, as it didn't take up as much room and possibly gave her slight comfort. I let my brother stay the night in my mother's room every night, since it comforted him so much, and he was so much younger than me. I almost felt bad if I said no. But with that choice, it meant that I was left utterly alone in my room every night, alone with the quiet scrapes that glided against the outside of the house, always slowly making their way towards my window every night. They always came around at 4 in the morning during the first week, always causing me to wake up from even the deepest sleep, no matter how quiet they were. I never dared to look outside the window next to me, but I knew someone or something was outside of it. I felt the burning stare against my face or back every night, which always accompanied the building pressure within my head, and sometimes even the light sound of impatient nails against the thin glass. After about a week, I began to grow frustrated at some points during the night, which was always followed by the soft, almost unintelligible dark and muffled giggle from outside the window, where it stood every night. At this point, the taunting came along with the darkened giggles, but instead, it somehow always made its way into my head, almost as if they were my own thoughts. You need to confront it. Maybe you should tell someone. Maybe it'll go away. You should take a nice long walk outside to clear your mind. The thoughts that plagued my own mind was almost convincing enough to feel like my own, to almost push me to do what they said. But I never did. This hell continued for another 2 weeks. I began to normalize its presence, and it started coming earlier in the night at the beginning of every week. From 4 in the morning to 3 in the morning to 2 in the morning, and then finally 1 in the morning. One morning, I sat on the carpeted floor of my own room, attempting to meditate, as I assumed it would be something that could possibly bring me some peace of mind and body, especially after what had been going on since we had moved here. After only 10 minutes, my frustration grew over the fact that the peace in mind and body I was so desperately searching for never came, and I was growing immensely bored at just sitting around, focusing on my breathing. I fell out of my crisscross applesauce position on the floor to a more comfortable one. I chose to lay on my side facing the wall next to my bed, right below the window, warm, intense daylight bleeding its way into the room. I quickly became intrigued when my eyes catch what seems to be part of the wall's baseboard, slightly pulled away from the wall, something thin and white, poking its way out from beneath. I began to wonder why I hadn't ever noticed the weird, broken piece of baseboard before, but quickly pushed it aside, not really caring all that much for the answer. I rolled over, my eyes intently fixed upon the spot on the wall, and slowly crawled towards it in curiosity-filled strides. Once I reached the wall, I opted to attempt to pull whatever was sticking out from beneath the baseboard out, only for it to quietly rip a bit behind the board, holding it hostage within. I instantly let what I now knew to be a piece of paper go, and decided ripping the white, thin board from the wall a little more would be the best choice. I assumed that if I hadn't noticed the baseboard before, what would breaking it a bit more really do, since nobody would notice, just as I hadn't. I gave the board a hearty tug with 2 hands until I saw the slightly ripped paper fall gently onto the carpet below. I quickly grabbed the thin sheet of folded paper and opened it to view its contents. Within was what seemed to be a long letter which read, Dear homeowner, whoever is reading this, I have to assume has moved into the home in which at the time of writing this is mine. If you have any common sense, pack back up and get out. Get out of this house and get out of town. I don't know what it is, but it loves to play a game. You may think if you just wait, it'll give up, but it's patient, and it's a part of the game. It loves to frustrate you, get you scared and alone. I've learned the more comfortable you get, the harder it tries to break you. Look at it all you want. Stare it down in all its glory if you would like. But no matter what you do, never tell a single living soul about it. I only know any of this because my older sister told me how afraid she was, how it had been taunting her as she tried to sleep at night, and then I never saw her again. A couple days after she disappeared, it started to watch me at night. It's been 5 months alone with this thing at night, and I can't take it anymore. The guilt and the pressure. I can't believe I didn't believe her. I'm sorry, Emma. I'm leaving this note attached to the house. I hope someone will find it and save themselves, since I wasn't able to do the same. Once I had finished reading the whole note, my blood began to run cold, and my pulse must have been racing fast enough to stop my own heart. I began to think about all the nights or family game nights I had almost caved or chose to confide in my mother, only to chicken out in the fear that I would be called insane. Little did I know my dumb, simple fear of being labeled as insane was actually saving my life. At times, I believed I was going insane all on my own. After reading the note, my scientific side began to have a hard time trying to believe any of it was real. In an attempt to have a reasonable, scientific explanation for the weird noises, I assumed it was someone in town trying to play a cruel prank on me for the first week. But as it continued, I began to believe it really wasn't a person. Deep down within me, I almost knew it wasn't, as if I always did. It was when I dropped the piece of paper back onto the ground when I realized that I had been holding my breath the whole time. The thought of it being there every night for the rest of my life, taunting me, playing with me like a distant game of cat and mouse from outside my window. It all made me want to break down and cry, something I hadn't done since my father had passed away over a year ago. Before his savings left to my mother disappeared quickly and we moved here, this nightmare of a home. To be honest, I constantly hoped it was all just an elaborate and long nightmare every night. That night, when the soft scrapes from outside the window hit my ears at exactly 1 in the morning, I woke up, and the pressure in my head began building like always. I finally chose to look. As these scrapes began near my window, I took a deep breath, my hands involuntarily shaking as I made my way out of the false safety of my bed and towards the window. My eyes stayed closed tightly until these scrapes subsided and were replaced with 5 distinct, impatient taps of nails against the thin glass inches from my face. Once the tapping ended and left the room silent and tense, I snapped my eyes open just in time to watch as its almost non-existent mouth slowly came into existence. So slow, it was as if time was sent into slow motion. Its teeth were all decaying, and randomly sharp in odd places. The smile was truly the most unsettling part about it. It was so tall and lengthy it simply stood hunched over, tilting its head now, still smiling at me. Every inch of it was a fuzzy, unsettling ink black. No eyes, just its smile. Fear began to well up within me as I stood there frozen, inches away from its grotesque, unnaturally wide grin. It began to heave up and down lightly, letting out its almost silent, darkened giggle. It then lifted its immensely long, jet-black fingers to tap its telltale pattern against the glass between us. Its fingers almost resembled a javelin but shorter, and more frightening. "You should let it inside. Tell your mother what you saw and then let it inside. She won't call you insane. You look delicious. You cannot win this game. It will be easier when you give in. The voice that slithered its way inside my thoughts for once actually began to frighten me, as they quickly stopped sounding like my own. They began to turn demonic and dark. The words went from softly caressing my mind to compel me, to violently ramming against every corner it can make its way into, seemingly prompting for a more forceful tactic. My whole mind felt like it was shaking, as if my brain was having a small earthquake and it was about to break. I instantly slammed my eyes shut tightly and jumped onto my bed, covering myself with these sheets, shaking anxiously. From that moment on, I never chose to look at it again. The one look I got of it was enough fear and pain for me to never even attempt to see it again. But that only made me grow more stressed somehow. The pain that grew in my head got worse after that night. It was never as bad as when I had stared it down, but still intense enough to make my head feel as if it had just come out of a coma. It only took me a week afterwards to cave, and that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm doing what it wants. It wins. All I have to say to you is, if you hear scratches or taps outside your home, don't look and get out. It's relentless and hungry. As I write this, the rest of my family is away at a friend's place for the night. I can feel the pressure on my head getting more intense as the sun goes down, making its way below the trees. And I know it's finally coming for me now. This time, it won't just watch me from my window. It's been waiting patiently these past months, and I finally caved, just like it wanted, just like it anticipated. I told someone. I told you. He's here now, but instead he's standing right beside my bed, giving me that dark, grotesque smile.